Today we'll take a look at how our incoming invoice complete solution is structured. We'll start with a sample invoice, exactly as a processor might first encounter it. We assume that some upstream process has already read the physical or digital invoice and extracted the key data. With this extracted data and a document stored in the DMS of your choice, a window then opens as currently displayed. First of all, the system checks whether potential duplicates exist. In this example, this is indicated by a prominent banner. I can review the statuses and key data of the suggested duplicates here and select the corresponding incoming invoice. I can even view the document itself. Since this is, in fact, a duplicate, we could now discard it automatically, though we won't do that at this point. You'll also notice that the invoice is displayed prominently on the right-hand side. On the left, we have our index data. At the bottom are documents, to which we could attach further files, as well as our line item data, shown here. The entire UI is designed so that colored elements let you immediately recognize the status of the information. Green naturally means everything is fine, while yellow or red indicates that something needs to be checked. Here we have a supporting function to help the initial reviewer validate the requirements placed on an invoice. We also have the option to check the supplier and reconcile it against the master data. In addition, we can assign the account here, deviating from the supplier's default settings. We also always run a check on whether the tax amount currently entered matches the gross and net values. If we were to adjust the gross amount here, for example, the tax would be rechecked, and the system would inform us that something doesn't add up. We even receive a correction suggestion that restores the original value. We have also implemented complete three-way matching here. This means the purchase order is reconciled with the invoice, with delivery notes, and goods receipt confirmations in the ERP system. In this example, we have, of course, built-in errors, so every match between each of the three elements shows a discrepancy. We can see this clearly with respect to the purchase order, and just as clearly, which line items show which differences. Take these tires we ordered, for example. According to the invoice, we have an R16, but what we ordered and received was an R17. The same is immediately apparent for line item 2. We can see that we ordered 4 units and, according to the invoice, should have received 4 as well. However, according to the goods receipt, only 3 of 4 have arrived. There's also a discrepancy in the amount. According to the invoice, we would be transferring 10 euros too much. With this information, you can of course contact the supplier and clarify how you want to proceed. Thanks to the reconciliation with purchasing, we also immediately see the differences that deviate from the order data. Here, for example, we can identify where the difference lies that we just saw. We can also see which goods receipt note is available in the system for it, and that the amount differs from the purchase order we placed. Of course, all of this can also be filtered by status, so that we only need to look at the problematic line items. The reconciliation with delivery data is presented just as clearly here. We are currently in manual mode. This means I can change everything manually. However, I also have the option of being supported by an assistant, which then makes suggestions based on the history. Here, for example, we can see that Cost Center 1310 is being suggested. I can simply accept it with a click, and using the question mark, I can additionally display why the assistant considers these suggestions to make the most sense. Alternative suggestions are also presented. A score calculated from various parameters indicates the relative weighting. The same happens at the line item level. This means I can select specific values per line item and have my assistant estimate and evaluate these parameters. I can accept all of this information at once or decide manually for each line item. At any time and at any step, I have the option of forwarding the invoice by raising a query, by forwarding the invoice entirely, and requesting an additional approver, or by having my approval replaced entirely by another approver. At all times, you can see in the workflow which step we are currently at and which steps follow. Suppose we have defined 3 different approvers at this point, a different one for each line item, because we define approvers on a cost center basis. In that case, a change to marketing, for example, means the approver is also selected according to those definitions. In this specific example, we use the cost centers to determine who the subsequent departmental approver should be. If we now proceed with the approval, we expect two forwarded parallel tasks to be created. And that is exactly what has happened. In the administrator role, we now arrive at an overview task showing us which line items have already been approved and which have not. Here we also have the option of overriding the process if something isn't working properly, and the invoice has gotten stuck with someone. In the task overview, we can see that two parallel tasks have now been created, in addition to our administrator task. In this first task, created in parallel, I can see that I meant to assess two line items. I confirm them with a check mark and, in this case, forward the invoice. As an administrator, I can check at any time where the invoice currently is and who still owes their task. In this case, we can see that the first two line items have already been confirmed positively, while the third is still awaiting approval or assessment. Now we'll carry out the assessment of the third line item. I could also simply say that I don't want to approve this line item, which would prompt me to provide a comment. In this case, however, we'll leave it at a positive approval and send the workflow on its way. We have now reached the final step, posting. Here, the accountant should carry out a final check that everything is correct. In this case, it's relatively straightforward, since the link to purchasing means we already defined, when the order was created, where and how each line item will later be posted in the ERP system. Everything looks good. By clicking Post here, a workflow report is generated, and the export file along with the journal entry is sent to the designated ERP system. We can view all invoices currently in circulation or historically processed at any time by clicking on the incoming invoice register. Here we have a clear overview of all invoices in the system, along with an overview of invoice due dates and early payment discount deadlines. These also show us right away how much of a discount we can save by paying the invoice on time. By clicking on the invoice we just approved, we can view more detailed information in the Detail pane. Here we see the document again, for example, as well as the generated and archived log I mentioned earlier. We can see which line item was approved by whom and when, which documents were handled, and further line item-based information. We also see all line items again in a clear overview. And in the history, we can see what was done, when, and by whom. We also have well-organized KPI elements that can give us more detailed benchmarking information. At any time, we can see the total sum of all displayed invoices and use a filter to narrow down the due date of the next invoice. Let's now look at another way of processing, bulk editing. Finally, let's look at how our incoming invoice solution is administered. The solution is designed to allow client-specific customizations to be made as needed. For example, we can see that we're able to define under which circumstances automatic posting may take place. We can define here for which client and at which approval step, which fields should be displayed, hidden, mandatory, and so on. We can define which core features each of my clients should receive. We can also make client-specific export adjustments. If we select an SAP export, for example, we can then easily define the SAP-specific export parameters in the corresponding menu for the selected client. In addition, it's possible here to make all special customizations according to client-specific requirements. We can choose from a number of predefined DMS providers and use extensions to add further hooks, which can then adapt the standard behavior as desired. We can configure the assistant itself in a wide variety of ways. Here we can define, for example, how the scoring should be structured per client. We can also define how the matching of invoice line items with the line items in purchasing should work. The same applies to matching against delivery data. In the client area, we always have an overview of which of our clients have special properties deviating from the standard. We can also transfer client-specific settings from one client to another in group clients, making it easier to build up a client landscape. In the Approval and Roles section, we can see how each client wants to structure their approval process. Here we can define, for example, that specific policies apply to approval by a managing director, by inserting certain thresholds above which a second or third managing director must add their approval.